All right, everyone, welcome back to week 3 and welcome to our coverage of Southeastern Europe. This week is really kind of our intermediate studies of countries that have a future within the European Union, but by and large still remain outside of that organization. When we refer to Southeastern Europe, we use the term as a more I guess in the last couple of years, it's become a more politically correct term to refer to the Balkans, right? Carries a more pejorative, stereotypical understanding of the bad neighborhood of Europe. And unfortunately, the Balkans got this stigma within the 1990s as Yugoslavia was breaking up into a number of successor states. And, especially in comparison to the then role model countries of Central Europe, the Balkans, Southeastern Europe, however way that you want to call it, I actually use the terms interchangeably, were definitely seen as the second-tier countries, right? Those that weren't given primary consideration into the EU were given kind of a passive, very long-term prospect for eventual membership, but still remains outside of that region, by and large. So this is really going to be our first real comparative analysis within this class. And we're going to note that a number of patterns that we talked about in Central Europe were practiced also here. But because of sizable minority communities, many of the political cultures and national identities that were espoused were met with some kind of resistance, right? Some kind of opposition. And that doesn't necessarily make the Balkans any different from Central Europe so much as because of the presence of minority communities, these political cultures, which existed in Central Europe but went on largely unchallenged, became something of a major problem within that region. So, the rundown that I want to give for this week, as far as this lecture is concerned, this is really just part 1. I want to look at the Balkans as a study in post-authoritarian transition that also includes multi-ethnic societies, right, something that is largely absent within Central Europe, the notion of state fragmentation and collapse, right, and this is almost entirely focused on the disintegration of Yugoslavia, the peripheral advantage vis-a-vis Central Europe. So even those countries like Bulgaria and to a lesser extent Romania, by and large, miss out on the first group of countries emerging from behind the Iron Curtain like Central Europe and are given really secondary status by the European Union, right? So it doesn't matter how good some of these countries perform. Bulgaria largely avoiding the problems that befall Yugoslavia and to a lesser extent Albania. They're kept really on the periphery. They're seen as really the second wave of countries entering. So even at their even on their best behavior, they're nowhere near as seen as successful or as important as Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic. And then finally, and this is equally important, something I'm going to focus on more so in the second lecture, but I'll bring it up in this one. A diminished European Union. We realize that the European Union no longer has the luster, the image, the high glossy brochure that it advertised Central Europe in the 1990s. All countries have indicated that they want to eventually join the EU, but this is an EU post-2008. So many of its problems, its corruptions, its dysfunctionalities are on full display for those that are still trying to negotiate their way in. The second lecture that I want to focus on is really a more of an in-depth examination of democratization of the region as structure in the absence of practice. So in other words, countries go through the procedural requirements and necessities to make it look like they are transitioning towards some degree of political pluralism. And like Central Europe, right, none of these countries are in any danger of receding into classic authoritarianism. But it's a type of transition that is, like Central Europe, elite-driven, coordinated with counterparts within the European Union, but because of the delay of EU membership, and this is especially true of those countries that have yet to get in, the idea of public disappointment in democratization and the understanding of the fall from grace of the EU as a sinecure for everything is much more on display in the region than it is in Central Europe. And this, sort of examines the missing democratic cultural narratives, very similar in scope to what we talked about in Central Europe. But here's the big difference. Central European countries can engage in some type of, illiberal democratic practice once they're in the EU, and there's very little oversight. But for the remaining countries, getting into the EU is still something that that's been indefinitely postponed. But the type of illiberalism is warped into this type of stabilitocratic form of political control that we'll talk about in more specifics in the second lecture, but suffice to say is a really good example of how autocracies can be given a passing grade by the EU so long as they provide stability, law, and order. So, with that said, welcome to the Balkans. We're trading in our Trabant for a Yugo. And as I mentioned, we're, traveling through Europe's last frontier. Right? An area that has yet to get into the EU, but an area that still carries a number of stigmas. This is the area of vampires and vampire hunters. It's the area of warlords who go on to become war heroes in their own countries and war criminals in every other country surrounding them. It's an area that has unfortunately taken on the ignoble stigma of being a group of countries and societies that has, in the loving words of Maria Todorova, who is as critical as I am in about to say this, suffering from too much history per square mile. So as Central Europe was rejoicing at the return to Europe and basking in the sunlight of an end of history, the Balkans effectively receded into the same type of tribalism, nativism, xenophobia, and ethno-nationalism that befell it 1 century earlier. Are these fair assessments to stigmatize the Balkans? I am here to say emphatically no. I am also here to say that many of the problems that befell the countries of Southeastern Europe were visible in Central, but because of the absence of any real minority in each of these countries and territories to challenge the prevailing political narratives of the day, these things were left largely unnoticed and under the radar until about 20 to 25 years later, when we get the political cultures exhibited through Kaczynski's Law and Justice Party and Orban's Fidesz. Be that as it may, right, whatever it happens to be, the facts are clear when it comes to Southeastern Europe, and that is many of these countries underwent what I call a two-phase transition, which is somewhat more methodical and I think much more realistic than their counterparts in Central Europe. In other words, these countries first transitioned from single-party communism to some form of competitive authoritarianism throughout the 90s. And then by the late 90s, 2000s, there were, major public demonstrations, another, wave of transitions that took these countries and transitioned them again into some kind of liberal, quasi-illiberal democratic system. Does this have anything to do with the legacy of communism, or more so the legacy of the 1990s? A lot of times academics will look at the slower rate of transition in the Balkans vis-a-vis Central Europe and just simply say, well, that's the heritage of the Ottoman Empire, of the Byzantine Orthodox civilization, of a region that was not part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it's tempting to buy into that sense of historiography. But as I'm going to make the case in this lecture, a lot of the assumptions about the Balkans are unfortunate stereotypes that are not grounded in historical empiricism. And so in this case, I'm much more likely to blame the legacy of the 90s as I am the legacy of communism, right? Because this is the neat thing about the Balkans, is that you get, as far as communism is concerned, some of the best cases and some of the worst cases, right? Yugoslavia was communism done right, in my opinion, but then right next door were some of the worst you got, bureaucratic authoritarianism in Bulgaria, you get a type of police state in Romania, and then finally you get almost this charismatic North Korean type of dictatorship in Albania. So with all of these cases, right, we're not talking about bureaucratic authoritarianism looking to negotiate their way out of power. But we end up looking at countries in which the old regime, or at least remnants of the old regime, are able to hold on to both power and leverage much better than their Central European counterparts. So when we consider the type of leadership of Sali Berisha in Albania, eventually succeeding someone like Enver Hoxha, we note someone who is much more willing and able and with the capabilities of governing Albania once again as sort of like a top-down, quasi-semi-democratic autocrat, right? He's certainly pro-Western, very pro-American, but internally at home, he still displays much of the characteristics of a Cold War tyrant. To a lesser extent, but no more problematic, is Romania under Ion Iliescu, who leads this sort of national salvation front in the country to replace the hated dictatorship of Nicolae Ceausescu, but is also seen as someone who is more of an internal Communist Party official, although a disgraced second-tier person, but someone who halted a growing and rather legitimate social revolution in Romania that began in the western city of Timișoara in the name of stability, order, and much more of a coordinated seizure of power. So we find in the Balkans, right, that there are leaders that are much more autocratic than Václav Havel, Lech Walesa, and others in Central Europe. But we also can't forget, right, that one of the big reasons for the maintenance of this type of leadership is because of the state collapse, the civil war, and the ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia. And this is probably one of the biggest tragedies, not only of the region, but of post-war Europe after 1945. The country breaks up through a series of civil wars and secessionist conflicts, and with the exception of Slovenia, which kind of breaks away fast and early and immediately, right, shuts the door behind them and starts hanging out in the Alps in Central Europe. The rest of the emerging Yugoslav republics are plagued with delays in EU integration by at least 1 decade. And that's largely for Croatia. When it comes to Serbia, Macedonia, Bosnia, and Montenegro, membership has been deferred by a generation, right? So the upcoming generation of people in these countries have little to no knowledge of what Yugoslavia was and probably don't even remember much of the wars of the 1990s. But these countries and those societies are forever stuck on the outside of the EU's gated community, right? So we note that the area, while connected to Brussels, is, comparatively speaking, much weaker in linkage and leverage. And, at a certain point, if the EU is going to continue to drag its feet and not really take any initiatives in inviting these countries in, some of them, like Serbia, for instance, are going to start looking elsewhere. They're going to start looking to solidify economic ties with Russia, China, Turkey, and others. And the EU is no longer going to have that monopoly on linkage like they did with Central Europe. And so it's really within this environment that we note that these countries are still undergoing some form of externally supported transition, and the rise of this so-called pro-EU autocrat. In other words, these countries have made it clear that they want to get into the EU. But because the European Union is giving them so many stringent criteria to meet various benchmarks and other areas of evaluation in the acquis communautaire, we find that this is even less of a public initiative than it was in Central Europe. So it's not lost on the people of the region that politics has atrophied once again, that democracy is an elite-driven, oligarchic enterprise, and that the sooner people realize that there's nothing that can really happen with public organization, public activism, electoral change, the better it is, because hope has largely, I don't want to say died, but has been deferred indefinitely, right, within this region. But with that said, we need to also understand the unique position of communist governments, once again also vis-a-vis that of Central Europe. Unlike our Central European counterparts, which were almost all some form of bureaucratic authoritarianism, communism was much more what we call national accommodative within the Balkans. You have the charismatic leadership of Josip Tito, who was seen as an independent war hero who owed very little to Stalin or the Soviet Union in liberating his country in the Second World War. In Romania, you had this emerging type of warlordism, this type of Weberian charismatic leader in Nicolae Ceausescu, who tried to create his own brand of communism, but ended up becoming somewhat more of a big brother than an Alexander Dubček. And I got to tell you, as far as Albania under Enver Hoxha, this is the one area that just still remains largely a black box to many scholars and academics within communist studies. Albania's, communism under Hoxha was probably the closest in terms of, let's say, North Korea. But even in this sense, right, Enver Hoxha was much more of a demagogue than some supplicant to that of the Soviet Union. So because we're dealing with at least three countries that didn't owe any lip service, military reliance, economic dependency on the Soviet Union, either reforms coming out of the Kremlin from Gorbachev in the 80s or the unraveling of communist legitimacy from the Soviet Union in the late 80s, early 90s did not affect the Balkans in the same way. This is especially true of Yugoslavia and Albania. So they do deserve some kind of special observation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're handicapped. But what we can also say is that because these communist movements, these authoritarian movements, were much more homegrown and had a much more of a national history of homegrown resistance from the Second World War, we have countries that have indigenous support for the system, unlike the satellite puppet states of Central Europe. So if you remember from last week, we're talking about the communists of Poland and Czechoslovakia and East Germany. These guys had no one else to fall back on but the Soviet Union. And when Gorbachev said, hey, I'm sorry, you got to figure this out for yourselves, all these governments fell like a house of cards. Within the Balkans, on the other hand, okay, the lack of external Soviet sponsorship gives them the ability to create their own military apparatus, their own sense of support networks and propaganda. And those that were challenging the system, those that were challenging communism, particularly in Yugoslavia and Romania, were not seen as elements of these democratic oppositions, but were actually seen as traitors to the state. A state that still had the ability to defend itself in some way, shape, or form. And this was more so in Yugoslavia than Romania. By this point, Romania created this, hated leadership with the Ceausescus. But communism in Yugoslavia, even throughout the 80s, right? Tito had died in 1980. He was still largely venerated. I mean, the man was genuinely liked by most people within Yugoslavia. And the post-Tito government, sort of, bureaucratic and, a little bit less with it than, Tito himself, still had a large degree of supporters. And we're not just talking about Serbs, but within Bosnia, within Montenegro, and Macedonia, who could look to the communist period and say this was a peak in their quality of life. Right? Yugoslavia was a positive thing for them. The quality of life, the standards of living, the incomes were great in comparison. So why would you want to get rid of this? Maybe the country could have transitioned like Hungary, but they never really got a chance. The point that I'm trying to make here is that there were people in these countries much more likely to defend the old regime than they were to discard it, like Central Europe. And so that's why it's plausible to look at armed conflicts resulting from attempts in transition. Whether it's the wars of secession of 91 to 95, right? I mean, today, and this is the thing, unfortunately, and this is a minefield in and of itself. But you ask random people in the former Yugoslavia, A, who was responsible for Yugoslavia's breakup, B, who were the perpetrators and who were the victims, you're going to get a different answer depending upon the republic that you go to. And many of these succeeding states will look at the wars of secession as wars of national liberation, right? That's just the prevailing historical narrative. It doesn't matter that the quality of life has gotten worse in some of these countries than it was within Yugoslavia. But the point I'm trying to make here is that those that fought to keep Yugoslavia together were really more than just a bunch of greater Serbian nationalists, as the narrative will have one believe in Croatia, in Kosovo, and within parts of Bosnia. Right? There were those that believed in keeping the thing together and reforming the system. And it doesn't mean that they go off and kill people left and right. But what I'm trying to say is that there is much more of an understanding of resistance to disintegration than we would find in Central Europe. That also explains an uprising in Romania. We're not just simply talking about protest politics that challenged and eventually overthrew the system, like Poland or Hungary or even Czechoslovakia, but we're talking about an actual armed insurrection that began in December of 1989 in the western Romanian city of Timișoara. This led to statewide crackdowns across the country. And, I'm moving the conversation along here, but to avoid a full-scale civil war, a legitimate social uprising was snuffed out, stifled, by an internal party coup within the Romanian communist officials that decided it's better to get rid of the Ceausescus and dismantle the Securitate, but keep the elite privileges of second and third level officials within the country. Just stop calling themselves communist. Envelop within this idea of National Salvation Front. But the point here is that there were even those within Romania that wanted to keep some pre-existing privileges and oligarchic structures intact. Very different from what we saw in Central Europe, in which the old regime had very little to fall back on. And, you add to this, EU aspirations that are either delayed in the form of Romania, Bulgaria, and eventually Croatia, and derailed, indefinitely derailed as far as everybody else. And it's not that the lack of democracy within the region has anything to do with something coming out of the Byzantine and the Ottoman period. It's that, the transition period from the 90s on has been much less smooth, much less straightforward, and far more opaque and problematic. It is not a cut and dry, transparent, no holds barred, all right-of-way road to the EU, as it was given to Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and even Slovenia. So, this kind of 30 years later produces a unique set of approaches that the European Union has to the region that's very different from that of Central Europe. And that is the EU, and it likes to tell itself that it's a facilitator of democracy and development. And I've been saying before, at the end of the day, the EU is an economic regulatory body. But because of what took place in Croatia, Bosnia, and the Serbian province of Kosovo, EU membership is predicated on some form of conflict resolution, much more problematic and far more requirements to meet than their Central European counterparts. So in other words, to get into the EU, there needs to be, some settlement of border disputes. Even Slovenia put Croatia to the test when it wanted to get in, long after Slovenia was given membership. And I have, no doubt, right? I have no doubt in my mind, right, that when the final issue of Serbia's EU membership is up, Serbia is going to have to figure out what it wants to do with its former/southern wayward province of Kosovo. But also to that, the European Union has predicated the empowerment of disenfranchised minorities within each of these states. So that means that, for instance, ethnic Albanians in Macedonia are going to be given far more political and constitutional rights and empowered privileges than minorities in Poland or Hungary or Italy or elsewhere are going to do. The same can be said for, let's say, the Albanians of Serbia proper, along with the Hungarians. When Croatia was negotiating its EU membership, a few mentions were, given towards the Serbian, minority. But the point to be made here is that these countries have to undergo, especially those that have yet to get in, some form of power sharing between the ethnic political majority and some political minority. That, of course, involves addressing conflict from the 90s, empowering minorities that otherwise would remain within the periphery, and somehow enforcing justice to wartime conflict, right? And this is especially true when it comes to Kosovo and to Bosnia. So in this sense, the European Union's requirements to get in are much more extensive and difficult than Central Europe was 15 to 20 years ago. The acquis communautaire has gone from 80,000 pages to most likely at this point 100,000. And, here's the problem, though. Half the region is already in. And this is considered Southeastern Europe now, right? That's like the more civilized, accepted, advanced part of the region. But as far as the remaining, losers at the back end of the cafeteria are concerned, this is a term that we now call the Western Balkans. Right? The Western Balkans, it's an area that includes Bosnia, Serbia, Northern Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, and if you consider it a country, Kosovo. It is the only time, ladies and gentlemen, where the term Western has a negative term. Why? Because it's in the Balkans, right? The Western Balkans, it's a region, it's an identity that was designed by committee, designed by academia. It has never been used beforehand. But it's simply a way of saying that part of Southeastern Europe that has yet to get into the EU and therefore remains the Balkans. You get into the EU, you now become a part of Southeastern Europe, not the Balkans anymore. Balkans, bad term. Southeastern Europe, good term. When you get in, remains to be seen, right? And the problem is that as membership talks are delayed and pushed down, goalposts are continuously adjusted to prevent membership from happening, the stigmatization of the Western Balkans takes on a whole new set of connotations. So instead of being a region awash in ethnocentric nationalism and ancient hatreds, which was a thing in the 90s, the so-called Western Balkans suffer from weak democracies, autocratic leadership, all of the stuff that we allegedly would not find, in the EU. Right? So the idea here is that the Balkans can only become Southeastern Europe once they enter into that exclusive club of EU membership. So this is our big introduction to the region. I hope that you've enjoyed the view from the window of your Yugo. I hope you've been taking some good pictures here. But we're going to meet right again in our next video and focusing directly on the phenomenon of democratic transition within the Balkans, given the constraints, the institutional and cultural legacies that we've talked about, and the stigma of the region that unfortunately still permeates the region today. So stay tuned because we are just getting started.